Then you ask yourself, well, what's the limit of that? Because that's the religious question, fundamentally, is, well, if you took on all the responsibility you could take on, and you faced everything that you needed to face, what would you be like? Who would you be? And how would the world transform around you? And, well, if the partial answer is, well, if I do that a little bit, things get a fair bit better, then the next question might be, well, what if you did that completely? And I don't think that's possible in some sense, right? It's like, perfection is a horizon that always recedes, but it isn't obvious to me what the upper limit of that is. And certainly we do see people, saints, let's say.
What I was going to say. It's a Mother Teresa. It's a Francis of Assisi.
Who kind of push the limit, and miraculous things happen around them, and maybe in the literal sense, and if not in the literal sense, close enough, for all intents and purposes. And so that's heartening.
I now welcome to our stage our own president, Father Dave Pavanka Chiowar. Father Dave became president of Franciscan University of Steubenville in 2019, the first Franciscan alumnus to lead the university. Father Dave also earned a Master of Divinity, an MA in Theology, a doctorate in education, an Executive Juris Doctorate. He is a member of the Most Sacred Heart of Jesus, province of the Franciscan Third Order Regular. He was ordained a priest in 1996. A well-known Catholic speaker, an author, Father Dave has written 7 books and produced several evangelistic films and video series, including Sign of Contradiction, Metanoia, and Letters to Myself from the End of the World, through the ministry of the Wild Goose. Please welcome Father Dave and our speaker, Dr. Peterson.
Well, thank you so much. And again, I'm just very pleased at the turnout and everybody being able to join us this evening. As Dr. Peterson and I were talking this morning, one of the things that he was mentioning was that he often doesn't come to universities anymore for many reasons. And we asked him, well, then why did you accept our invitation? And his response was, because you seem different. I hope that was a compliment. And it's been a blessing to have Dr. Peterson with us. He's been so generous with his time all morning, spending time joining us and seeing our campus, joining us for liturgy. So it's been a great blessing and honor to have you with us. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much for the invitation.
So I appreciated Dr. Peterson's discussion on the corpus of the scripture of the Bible and the book. And one of the things that he and I had talked about was to discuss a book, not the book. Fair enough?
Yeah, definitely.
So when I was praying and discerning about which chapter I wanted to talk about and what I thought was most appropriate, there were a few things that were going through my mind. On Monday, we're starting the holiest week of the year for us. We're entering in a Holy Week, which is a time that invites the church and the people of God to look at the cross, that is ultimately going to lead us to the cross, and how suffering is so central to the Christian experience, and Christian redemption comes about through suffering. So there was that I was continuing to think about, but I was also pleased, Lord, reflecting on the fact that we're near the end of the pandemic. And one of the things that I've been praying about over the last many weeks and months is how the pandemic has placed in forefront of our culture suffering and death and pain. And it seems to me that we have not dealt with that very well. We've got to the place where so many people are riddled in fear, as if suffering is to be run away from at every cost, at every opportunity. The idea that there actually could be something beautiful and holy and salvific about suffering. So when I was reading through your book, and I saw in the last chapter, you speak about suffering and being able to do that with a sense of gratitude. I just felt that that was the place that maybe we could talk about this evening. And what does that look like? At the very beginning of the chapter, you say, Much of your life, you have been searching for certainty. And then you pivot very quickly to speak about suffering. So maybe two questions. Your search for certainty, how has that brought you to what you spoke about earlier this evening? And why did you make such a quick pivot to talk about suffering?
Well, I think it's because if you're looking for certainty, the reality of suffering is certain. I mean, what do you accept as evidence above all else? That's a good question. That's a hard question. But I would say pain is up there. It's very difficult not to believe in the reality of your own pain. It's somewhat easier not to believe in the reality of other people's pain. That's not so easy either, you know. But your pain seems to be undeniably real. And so it does beg a question, which is, you know, if pain is undeniably real, is that which overcomes pain even more real? And I think that's, in some sense, that's the idea that lurks behind the idea of the resurrection. I mean, I was going to tell a story during this lecture today, although there wasn't really a place for it, but maybe this is a good place for it. I'll tell you something else I've been thinking about, which really knocked me for a loop, let's say, which I probably still haven't really recovered from. So a long while back, I had planned to do a series on Exodus. I did a biblical series on Genesis, which people seem to appreciate, which I found extremely useful. It was quite a privilege to have the time and the space to walk through those books and try to understand them, first psychologically, and I like to speak about things psychologically before I would ever dare to speak about them religiously. I think you leave that for last resort in some sense. I was thinking about some of the ideas that I talked about today, you know, about the Bible being the foundation of the lens through which we look at the world. We have this idea that the Bible is a living text. And, you know, if we embody it, then it's a living text. That's actually accurate. And I think to the degree that we're avatars of the Judeo-Christian tradition, that we do embody it for better or for worse. And we're stuck with that, or blessed by it, or both. The reason I didn't tell you the story was because I didn't know how to weave it into the theme that I was developing tonight, but it's relevant to the theme of suffering and the reality of suffering, and perhaps what might be more real than suffering. So I'll tell you the story. Hopefully I can do this reasonably briefly. When Moses is leading the Israelites through the desert, I'm very compelled by that story. You know, so for example, one of the things that's really interesting about it is that the story begins with a tyrannical state, and then it's the Spirit of God that leads the Hebrews. Maybe it's the Spirit of God that characterizes the Hebrew longing for freedom. And that's kind of an interesting idea, you know, psychologically. You think that, what's the Spirit of God? The Spirit of God is that which manifests itself within you in opposition to tyranny. Could be, you know, that's not a bad idea. It's quite an idea. It's a remarkable idea. And maybe it's true. It's certainly the case that that's how God is presented in that story, and in many other ways, but that being paramount above all. And you know, there's another corollary to that, which is, well, we shouldn't be subjects of tyranny if we're children of God, if we're Israel, and Israel means we who struggle with God. It's not appropriate for us to be subject to tyranny. And that's interesting too, because I think we sort of accept that idea at face value in the West, is that, yeah, slavery is wrong, obviously. It's like, it's not so bloody obvious, these things. One of the things that I'm really curious about in relationship to the postmodern types who make group membership the sine qua non of existence is, why is slavery wrong? Exactly. It's like if we're all groups and one group lords it over another, it's like, that's not wrong, it's just tough luck for the oppressed group. There's no wrong there, because it's only wrong if we're sovereign individuals, right, with some intrinsic worth, who are not to be subject to arbitrary tyranny. That's when it's wrong, and you have to accept all those other axioms before you get to say anything about slavery being wrong at all. Otherwise, it's just, hey, like Marx pointed out, it's just brute economics. And so you can make a moral judgment about that if you want, but what's your criteria for saying that it's wrong? And of course that would upset people on the radical left who want to presume that it's intrinsically wrong without having to presume all the things that you have to presume to make it intrinsically wrong, and without even noticing that that's just a sleight of hand. In any case, so that's part of that biblical narrative too. We're not the sorts of creatures who should be subject to tyranny. And then the tyranny might be, well, is it the tyranny of a state, or is it the tyranny we impose on ourselves? And I would say probably both. Why not both? The story could be referring to both. We tyrannize ourselves with our own presuppositions all the time. And then you might ask yourself, why? Why don't we just give up our tyrannical presuppositions? Because they're not worthy and they're oppressive, but we don't give them up and more often celebrate them. And I think the story has an answer for that too, because it's out of the tyranny into the desert. It's like, is that better or worse? How about worse? And so what if it's the case that even to escape from the tyranny of your own presuppositions, that you don't go from the tyranny to the promised land, you go from the tyranny to the desert? And who the hell, wants to do that? And the answer is no one with any sense. It's like, hey, I'll just keep the tyranny, thank you very much. At least I know where everything belongs there. And fair enough. this is a very serious question, and it's an open question in the Exodus narrative whether the desert is worse or better than the tyranny. And so, you see this in the real world. Lots of people in the Soviet Union pined for the days of Stalin. So I read a book once that was reminiscences of a extermination camp written by the guards, the good old days. So I don't think there's a tyranny that's so brute that we can't long for it if it's been shattered. And so that's quite something, all that packed up in that story. Anyways, so the Israelites are out in the desert, and they're there for 40 years, and you might think, well, what kind of leadership do they have? It's not that big a desert. And the answer is, yeah, but the desert after a tyranny, that's no bloody joke, and maybe it takes 3 generations to get through it. And that's possible. And so there's all that, and then the Israelites are wandering around in the desert, and what happens? Well, the same thing happened to them as is happening to us. They're worshiping false idols, and they're tempted. And it's no wonder they're tempted, because, well, they're in the desert. It's like it's not going so well. It's no wonder they're having a crisis of confidence, and maybe they're pining for the old days, and they're not so sure that the God who informed them that being the subjects of tyranny was wrong, because now here we are in the desert. And so they lack faith. And it's understandable. But despite it being understandable, and this is one of the harsh things about the story, what does God do when he hears their complaints? He sends poisonous snakes in there to bite them. I think that's pretty brutal. And that's the sort of thing that makes the technical atheist type sort of recoil about the conceptions of God in the Old Testament. It's like, it's not exactly what you'd expect in some sense from an all-merciful being. It's like you got these poor Israelites. First of all, they were in the tyranny. Then they had to go across the Red Sea. Now they've been wandering around in the desert, and that's not good. And so your best solution is to send a bunch of snakes in to bite them? But you think, well, even if you're in the desert after a tyranny and you lose faith, then the snakes are going to bite you, right? Because that's what happens. Because if you're in, a little analog of hell and you lose your faith, is that going to make it worse or better? And the answer is, well, I have reason to lose my faith. It's like, fair enough. That isn't the question. The question is, what happens if you lose it? Or you start looking for faith in the wrong directions? And the answer is, hell gets a little deeper. And it's one of the things that really frightened me. I spent a lot of time studying atrocity, and I realized on a metaphorical level that the reason hell is a bottomless pit is because no matter how bad it is, there is some bloody stupid thing you can do that will make it worse. And that's right, and that's a terrifying realization to really understand that. And so, okay, poisonous snakes. And so now the Israelites are not only lost, but they're being bitten by venomous creatures. And there's an echo of the snake in the Garden of Eden in that story. And so finally the Israelites, they get kind of tired of being bitten by the snakes. And they go to Moses and say, you want to have a chat with God? Because you seem to be in there fairly tight with him. How about you get him to call off the snakes and maybe we'll behave a little better? How's that for a deal? And Moses says, okay, I'll see what I can do. And he goes and has a chat with God, which is no trivial matter. And God doesn't do what you'd expect, because what you'd expect, and this would even work in terms of making it a comprehensible narrative, you'd think, okay, all right, guys, you've been bit enough, no more snakes. But that isn't what happens. And I think the reason that it doesn't happen is because there's no getting rid of the snakes. I think that's also why there's a snake in the Garden of Eden, is there's just no getting rid of the snakes. You have to learn to contend with them. It's more that. Or maybe it's better to learn to contend with snakes than it is to inhabit a world where there's no danger. Maybe it's something like that. I don't know. Anyways, God says something extremely surprising and very interesting from the perspective of a clinical psychologist. He tells Moses to cast snake in bronze and to raise it up on a staff. And the staff seems to me to be a reference to the staff of Moses. And that staff of Moses is something like the thing you put in the ground to orient yourself with. It's the staff of God too, and it's sort of like an axiom. And maybe it's like the tree of life. It's like, here I stand. It's a center point. It's all of that. In any case, you put the snake up on the staff. That's also the symbol of healing, right? The physician symbol of healing, the staff with the snakes. And so it is a symbol of transformation, and partly that's because snakes shed their skin and are reborn, and so they're viewed as agents of transformation. And so that's all lurking in that symbol. And then God says, get the Israelites to go look at the snake on the staff, and then the poison won't poison them anymore. And I read that as a clinician. I thought, that's really interesting, because one of the things that we learned, all schools of psychotherapy learned in the last 100 years, is that if you get people to voluntarily confront what makes them afraid and what makes them want to avoid, then they get better. It's curative. And so that's the message there. It's like, well, if something is terrifying you, pay more attention to it. And that's actually what you teach people in psychotherapy. I mean, there's a variety of psychotherapeutic techniques, but exposure is probably the cardinal technique. It's like, if I can find out what you're avoiding and get you to confront it voluntarily, you'll get better. And the reason seems to be is that if you get people to confront what they're afraid of, and sometimes what disgusts them, but what they'd like to avoid, let's say, if you get them to confront it voluntarily, that could be the future even, the indeterminate future, they don't get less afraid. they get braver. And that's different. It's not like they get accustomed to what they're looking at and they're no longer afraid. That kind of happens, but it isn't really what happens. What really happens is they discover there's a lot more to them than they thought. And so they're not as easily intimidated then. And so if you run a clinical client through a session of exposure therapy, maybe they're afraid of an elevator or something like that, you get them so they'll go in the elevator, then sometimes they're often women, because women have anxiety disorders more often than men. One of the unintended consequences of that often is they'll go home and have the fight with their husband that's been brewing for 30 years. Because they're now braver. They see themselves in a different light because they've confronted this thing that terrifies them. And so it's so interesting in that story that God's cure for the venomous serpent is voluntary exposure to the source of terror. It's so interesting that that's the